as you frequently will hear from commentators, is Luke's emphasis on women. Luke mentions a number of women, and what we're going to look at today are women who are unique in Luke's gospel. They're not mentioned in any of the other gospels, which is significant. Oftentimes, as I said, they're anonymous, but they also they don't say anything, or at least very little. And some recent commentators have kind of pushed back against some of the traditional comment that says, oh, Luke is very much in favor of women. No, Luke has kept these women silent, and Luke is therefore something of a misogynist and all of that. That's a debate that could take days, weeks, years to work through. But what I think is important is the fact that we have these women in the gospel, and what Luke often does is pair the women with a story about a male, which is an interesting thing. And I think the traditional view of this, and I tend to agree, is that Luke is really very interested in showing that this gospel is open to all. Luke wants to give a counter. For instance, the first one we want to look at. So just to give you a bit of a rundown here of what we're going to do, and who knows about time, we'll see how far we get. But these episodes are, number one, the widow at Nain, the woman who loses her son, whose son dies. Order us a pizza. They used to say that to students. Probably not very. Anyway, the widow whose son dies and Jesus raises the son. Interestingly, that occurs immediately after the story of the centurion who goes to Jesus and asks him to come to his house. And then as Jesus approaches, you know the words, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. So this is a kind of companion story. That Jesus heals the servant or the son of the centurion, depending on your translation. And then he raises the son of the widow of Nain. In the same chapter, chapter 7, you have the story of the woman who comes into the Pharisees' banquet and washes the feet of Jesus, anoints them, and Jesus declares that her sins are forgiven. That's also unique in Luke's gospel. That's immediately followed in chapter 8 by a couple of verses that tell us that women came with Jesus or followed Jesus from Galilee and attended to his needs out of their own resources. That's chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Then in chapter 13, there's a story of a severely crippled woman who comes to be healed at the synagogue. In chapter 15, there is the woman who loses a coin. That's paired with, or it immediately follows, the story of the lost sheep. So there again, you have a story of a shepherd who loses the sheep, and then a woman with the lost coin. She calls in her neighbors and celebrates. And then in chapter 18, there's the story of the persistent widow who goes after the judge and demands justice from him. That's again a unique story in Luke. And then Luke has the story that he shares with Mark of the widow's mite, of the widow who puts in 2 coins, and Jesus praises her. I hope we can get to that a little bit. And then finally, another unique story in Luke is the women on the way to the cross, where Jesus says to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me." We're going to hear that in the Passion this year, when according to Luke, on Palm Sunday, we'll hear that little snippet where Jesus speaks to the daughters of Jerusalem and encourages them. There's a bit of a lament there as well. So those are all unique in Luke's gospel. So let's take a look. I had this lovely PowerPoint prepared. You can imagine that you're seeing it here. The first is the widow at Nain. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 to 17. And I think you know the story. It would normally be read on the 10th Sunday in Ordinary Time in this current year C. However, we won't be hearing it this year because of the Easter Pentecost cycle, which doesn't end until July 6th. So it kind of preempts that 10th. We won't be hearing it on Sunday. But you know the story. He enters a city called Nain. They're bringing out the son who has died on his bier, and he halts them, and he says to the woman, "Do not weep. Do not weep." He stepped forward and touched the coffin. At this the bearers halted, and he said, "Young man, I tell you, arise." And he gives him back to his mother. It's a lovely little story, as I said, that complements the story of the centurion and the healing of his servant or son. But one thing that we might notice is Jesus says to her, "Do not weep." Do you think that's normal? Yeah, like she's doing what comes naturally. She's lost her only son. She's lost her, in this culture, as many commentators say, she's lost her means of support, her means of having a living. She'll be a widow who's destitute. So do not weep. What do we make of that? Jesus is, well, how would you respond to that question? Is that the appropriate thing for Jesus to say?
I didn't know he was Jesus. I think, well, that's very uncaring. It was like,
Yeah.
you're not sympathizing, empathizing with me as far as
Yeah, we don't hear of any connection right away, or any indication that the woman knows who this is.
Unless he's asking her to have hope, like in a different kind of way, right? She could be hopeful. She doesn't maybe understand who Jesus is, but.
Yeah, given what we know happens in
Right.
the story, there's a kind of sense of comfort. Well, don't weep because boom, But I think there's a lesson there for us, at least in a roundabout way. I used to work as a bereavement counselor for a hospice organization in eastern North Carolina. And one of the things that was always a part of following people after a patient died was to encourage their sorrow, to encourage their emotion. I think sometimes we too often push Kleenex at someone who starts to cry, someone who starts to have a bit of an emotional moment. We become embarrassed by doing that. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what we have here, but it's something to think about, I think. To think about the meaning of this admonition of Jesus. Other than that, it's gospel, and so the conclusion is the people begin to glorify God. A great prophet has arisen in our midst, and God has visited his people. This report about him spread through the whole of Judea and in all the surrounding region. So it's a lovely story of this anonymous woman. But I want to turn to the story of the woman at the end of chapter 7. It's a long story, but to put it in a nutshell, a Pharisee invites Jesus to dine with him. He enters the Pharisee's house, and as they're sitting at the table, a woman comes in, begins to bathe Jesus' feet with her tears, wipe them with her hair, and then anoint his feet with ointment. And then the Pharisee says to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of woman this is. Jesus then replies, Simon, I have something to say to you. And then he goes on to say, when I came in, you didn't give me water to bathe my feet, which would have been customary. You didn't greet me with a kiss. You didn't do all the usual things to welcome a guest. And yet this woman has not only given me water, but bathed my feet with tears, has anointed my feet with oil, has kissed my feet, not just my cheek. And then he concludes with, he says, so I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. Hence, she has shown great love. Hence, she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven, loves little. He said to her, your sins are forgiven. And there's a kind of an amazement at his ability to say, your sins are forgiven. What I wanted to point out is this idea, do you see this woman? Jesus says to Simon, do you see this woman? Think about that, to be seen. How does Simon see this woman? How does the Pharisee see her?
He sees her sin first.
Sees her as a sinner. Says the text, I shouldn't jump in like that. Sees her sin. He what's his attitude toward her? Clark?
Disdain.
Yes.
Disdain? Yeah.
She has no worth.
No worth. She's invading their space, huh? What's she doing here?
It's more like seeing a classification rather than a person.
Yeah.
Fitting people into categories, and you see the category, not the real person.
Okay. The translation is interesting. There was a sinful woman in the city who, this is the NAB, this is the official translation of the American Catholic Church. There was a sinful woman in the city who learned that he was at table in the house. It describes her as a sinful woman. The Greek, or a more literal translation, is a woman who was a sinner. And the word that was there can even be translated as a woman who used to be a sinner. So the Greek there, a woman who used to be a sinner. So Simon sees her categorically. Simon sees her as a sinner, as someone who is invading their space. How does Jesus see her?
As his child.
Very, very humble.
As a child, as his child.
As his child, yeah.
Can you say more what you mean?
Well, I mean, he sees her, the way a parent sees a child with perfection. He cherishes her. So
Okay.
He doesn't see her something less.
He cherishes her. He sees her. We use that frequently. Are you really seen? Not just looked at, but are you really seen? He sees her, not simply a category, but he sees her. Anything else? How does Jesus see her?
He's open to her, he allows her to approach him and touch him.
Yeah, there's another thing. Culturally, the fact that she's even touching Jesus is culturally taboo. Anything else? So the language there is interesting. We often immediately assume, and what do you think her sin is?
I don't know, I feel like in the New Testament, there's so many women who are, their sin is adultery or.
Her sin is adultery or prostitution.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, we kind of assume that, but the text doesn't say that. The text doesn't say. In chapter 5, which I think is, if I remember right, we had this gospel a couple of weeks ago of Peter putting out Jesus teaching in Peter's boat,
Mhm.
and then he says, "Go out and catch and lower your nets." And when they pull in the fish, Peter says, "Depart from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." What do you assume Peter's sin is?
It's different for the men than it is for the women.
Exactly, exactly. We assume right away, and this often happens throughout the Bible, we assume when a woman is characterized as sinful, that she's a prostitute. But nowhere does it say that. And in fact, the word prostitute isn't used of any of these women all through. The only time we have that word is in the story of the prodigal son, which is also unique to Luke. But we hear early on that the young son goes and goes through his inheritance with loose living. That's all the text says, whatever that means. But the older brother then says, he's wasted all his money with prostitutes. The point being that we often make these assumptions that are almost unconscious. So who is this woman actually? And I like this point that the grammar there says this woman was a sinner. This woman, you could translate, as I said, used to be a sinner. And at the end of the story, Jesus turns to her and he says, remember what he says to Simon, her many sins have been forgiven. Hence, she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. He said to her, your sins are forgiven. But there again, the grammar in Greek, that are is perfect passive. Your sins have been and continue to be forgiven. The conjecture is that this woman found forgiveness before she even came into the banquet. It's not because, in the translation in the NAB, the New American Bible, is very good because she has shown great love. Many sins have been forgiven, hence she has shown great love. She hasn't been forgiven because she showed love, because of what she did to Jesus. She has been forgiven, therefore she has showed this act of thanksgiving in some way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I hope that point's not too subtle. But this perfect passage, your sins have been and continue to be forgiven. Her sins, which were many, were forgiven, therefore, or hence, she has loved much. It's a really interesting story, the dynamic that's going on here and what we assume about her. Nothing says she was a prostitute or any of that, but it's interesting how culturally we sort of assume that sometimes.
Peter, quick
Yes.
question. Is it true that traditionally this woman has been identified with Mary Magdalene, even though, of course, that is not said in Luke's gospel?
You're reading my mind.
Okay.
Because that's the very next thing I want to point out. In the very next episode, beginning of chapter 8, afterwards he journeyed from one town and village to another, preaching and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. Accompanying him were the 12 and some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, Chuza, Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their own resources. Pope Gregory the Great, in the 6th century, gave a homily in which he identified the woman in chapter 7 with Mary Magdalene, because she's identified, because she's mentioned right here, and we hear about these 7 demons who have gone out of her. And in ancient culture, demons were thought to have penetrated women. Demons were thought to have prostituted women. But nowhere, as you said, nowhere does it say that that woman is Mary Magdalene. Is she the woman there? Probably not. I don't think Luke is trying to identify her. And Mary has gotten a bad rap through the centuries, where she really, when we examine her closely, she really is not identified as a terrible prostitute or a sinful woman, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Why do we immediately assume that that was sexual? She could have been cured of diseases. Who knows? But I was watching that series, The Chosen, and there you have Mary Mag. She's a demoniac. She's somebody who is possessed, and so on. But is she really? The interesting thing is that you have these women who are part of the entourage, who are providing for their needs out of their own resources. That's a significant thing. And these women show up at the foot of the cross. They see where Jesus is buried, and they are the ones who go Sunday morning to anoint the body and discover the empty tomb. These women who have been providing for Jesus and his disciples out of their own resources. It's an interesting, I think it's unique again to Luke. It's a very interesting portrayal of these women who are part of Jesus' entourage. I have to think that Luke is building them up, is lifting them up as exemplary, and not because they are silent, not putting them down. But as I said, that's the current debate.
Was it cultural that there were no women authors in the Bible?
Probably, though the authors of the Gospels are completely anonymous.
Right.
The titles of the Gospels were appended.
They feel like they're written by men, but yeah.
There's certainly a what shall I say, a masculine sense, and this is the problem that many women have in reading the Bible. I think that there's a kind of, that women are silent, that there is a kind of sense that Jesus and his disciples, and there again, recent commentators say, why do we immediately assume that when it talks about Jesus' disciples, that we're thinking of men? When you hear about the 12 apostles, yes, they're named, but the 12 apostles are a unique group. Jesus' disciples are often cited as this large group of people, but we often think of Jesus' disciples as men. which is, again, a matter of our sensibilities as we hear, as we listen to the things. How are we doing here? Oh, good. I wanted to go to another unique story, and that is this story of the crippled woman in chapter 13 of Luke's Gospel. We never hear this on a Sunday. At that time, he was teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and a woman was there who for 18 years had been crippled by a spirit. She was bent over completely, incapable of standing erect. When Jesus saw her, he called to her and said, "Woman, you are set free of your infirmity." He laid his hands on her, and she at once stood up straight and glorified God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant that Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, said to the crowd in reply, "There are 6 days when work should be done. Come on those days to be cured, not on the Sabbath day." The Lord said to him in reply, "Hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his ass from the manger and lead it out for water? This daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 years now, ought she not to have been set free on the Sabbath day from this bondage?" When he said this, all his adversaries were humiliated, and the whole crowd rejoiced at all the splendid deeds done by him. It's kind of a shame that we don't hear that at all during the Sunday liturgies. It doesn't appear anywhere in the lectionary. But the assumption, without being stated, this woman is ill because she's a sinner, right? She's beset by demons, she's beset by Satan because she's sinful. Yet, should we immediately assume that? No. And this woman comes to the synagogue. She's there to pray. One can assume that she comes regularly. She comes to glorify God. She comes to pray. But Jesus points out the hypocrisy of the legalism of the synagogue leader, and so cures this woman, or what I prefer to say rather than cure is that he frees this woman. And that's something that you see throughout Luke's gospel in particular. Not that it's absent from the other gospels, but Luke really puts emphasis on the Greek word aphesis and its variations, which means to be set free. Jesus, to digress a little bit, in his opening sermon in Nazareth in chapter 4, Jesus quotes Isaiah, and the underlying theme, the thread through all of what he says is people are being set free. And that's what happens throughout Luke's gospel. People are set free. Now, what does that mean?
I think it scared the leadership because it said you don't have to be bound entirely to 600 and some rules of Torah.
Yeah.
There's a freedom that you have, so that if you violate one of those rules, you're not lost forever. So.
Yeah, that's one thing.
No fear.
No fear. Yeah, to be set free from your fears. So imagine what that feels like. Set free from poverty, set free from disease, set free from from those things that terrify us about life. To be liberated. This woman has been set free. This daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 years now, ought she not to have been set free on the Sabbath day of this bondage? If the Sabbath is about anything, it's about being set free. The Sabbath itself, the lovely Jewish tradition, that the Sabbath is that day when we celebrate creation, and that day when instead of doing, we simply be. I love that. I know that digresses a little bit, but the idea that the Sabbath, it kind of makes you think we should honor the Sabbath by not working, by not doing all kinds of stuff. That we should celebrate the fact that we are free. And so this woman is set free. The next one I wanted to yeah. So chapter 15. Chapter 15, it begins with Jesus talking to tax collectors and sinners, all drawing around to listen to him. But the Pharisees and the scribes began to complain. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And then we have the story of the lost sheep, the one who loses the sheep out of 100 and goes off to find it, and there is great rejoicing. But then, unique in Luke's gospel, is this story. Or what woman, having 10 coins and losing one, would not light a lamp and sweep the house, searching carefully until she finds it? And when she does, she calls together her friends and neighbors and says to them, "Rejoice with me because I have found the coin that I lost." In just the same way, I tell you, there will be rejoicing among the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now I ask you, does this make sense? What woman, having 10 coins and losing one, would spend so much time looking for that one and then throwing a party, probably spending more than what she lost for the party? What could this story mean?
It's a mystery. It's a mystery.
It's a mystery. Thank you, Father. What might it be about? It's not about economy. It's not about the expense.
I mean,
It's about imitating God's superabundance of love and mercy. In other words, be extravagant. God is extravagant
Yeah.
with his mercy to us, or his forgiveness, his love. And so this woman was being extravagant in her gratitude.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the correlation with Jesus, like the lost souls, that he can find one.
Yeah. Yeah. The logic, it was the same with the shepherd.
Yeah.
Is it really logical that a shepherd is gonna leave 99 of his sheep and abandon them, basically, to go off and find the one? Makes no sense whatsoever. What shepherd would do that? People are saying, no shepherd with any right mind would do that. Or what woman, having lost her one coin, would tear the house apart and then throw a big party? No woman would do that. But the extravagance of God's mercy, the extravagance of forgiveness. And then, of course, as you probably know, those two little stories are followed by the story of the father and his two sons. A lot of people like to call that the prodigal father, because it's the father who's really a spendthrift with his generosity. But this whole chapter 15 is about this generous, unbounded mercy of God. And Luke has a story of a woman, a unique story of a woman as part of that as well. Many of us think that, or wonder sometimes why he didn't include the mother in that story of the prodigal son, you know? Where was the mother with all of this? Why didn't she straighten him out?
Peter, for parallelism, you might call that story the lost son.
Yes.
What father loses a son? It makes no sense,
Excellent.
just as the other two make no sense. And I think because we've heard them so often, we just kind of gloss over, well, of course a shepherd would go find the lost sheep. No, he wouldn't.
Yeah.
But I think when whoever heard the story first was saying, no, that makes no sense. We, having heard it 100 times, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make
And of
sense,
course,
except in the overflowing abundance of grace.
I don't know if any of us are shepherds, so, we would have no clue about what a shepherd would do, and unless you're OCD, you're not gonna spend all of your time, looking for one coin, that you lost. That's kind of stupid. The next unique woman in Luke's gospel is the story of the persistent widow. And this is one we're gonna hear this year on the 29th Sunday of Ordinary Time. That will fall on October 19th. So it's always kind of a fun story. Then he told them a parable about the necessity for them to pray always without becoming weary. He said, there was a judge in a certain town who neither feared God nor respected any human being. And a widow in that town used to come to him and say, render a just decision for me against my adversary. For a long time the judge was unwilling, but eventually he thought, well, it's true that I neither fear God nor respect any human being. Because this widow keeps bothering me, I shall deliver a just decision for her, lest she finally come and strike me. The Greek there actually literally translated says, lest she give me a black eye. The Lord said, pay attention to the dishonest judge. That's what you're doing, paying attention to the dishonest judge. Will not God then secure the rights of his chosen ones who call out to him day and night? Will he be slow to answer them? I tell you, he will see to it that justice is done for them speedily. But when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Now there's a lot of confusing sayings there, things like that. But this unjust judge, she may, as I said, she may wear me out. She might do me violence. She might come and strike me, as we heard here. But literally, it's giving me a black eye. Who is this judge? Does this judge represent God? When you think about it, he's called an unjust judge, or he's refusing this woman justice. I would say not. It doesn't represent God. So the parable can be confusing because we hear that it's about praying persistently. It's about, as it says at the beginning, a parable about the necessity for them to pray always without becoming weary. But the whole idea isn't that the judge represents God and the woman represents us praying constantly, but this notion that we can rely on the mercy and justice of God, that we come to pray, we come to think about again the wideness of God's mercy. It's a typical parable in some ways that makes you think, what does this really mean? What can Jesus be talking about here? Parables are meant to be understood as something that teases us into thinking. The point should not be immediately obvious to us. And as most people would say, that little introduction, he told them a parable about the necessity for them to pray, was the editor's way of introducing the parable. Jesus himself probably didn't say, well, now here's a story about why you should pray first. The editor is interpreting that for us in some way, but sometimes that hampers our interpretation. We should read the parables for what they are, just like the sower and the seed. The little interpretation there that's given, put into the mouth of Jesus, probably the gospel proclaimer's way of explaining what Jesus is talking about. But there's so many possibilities for thinking about that parable. It's a good example of parable interpretation. This story, I don't know if anybody want to chime in at this point, or
Well, I was just thinking about how in verse 8, or 7, sorry, it will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night. Like in some of the parables, it's like the idea of how much more would God do this if an unjust judge will do this, right? So it's how
Yeah.
much more will
yeah,
God
Yeah.
grant
if the judge,
listen to your prayer if an unjust judge will do that.
yeah, that's a good point. If the judge finally gives in, so
Yeah.
to speak, how much more is God ready to answer us in some way? God who is like the prodigal father, not standing there with his arms crossed, waiting, I knew you'd be back sooner or later, but the God who is ready to just unlock this mercy. That's a good point, thank you. So the next one, this is a story that Luke shares with Mark. It's not in Matthew, but in Mark. And this also, strangely enough, never occurs on a Sunday. It never occurs in our lectionary at Sunday Mass. When he looked up, he saw some wealthy people putting their offerings into the treasury, and he noticed a poor widow putting in 2 small coins. He said, I tell you truly, this poor widow put in more than all the rest, for those others have all made offerings from their surplus wealth, but she from her poverty has offered her whole livelihood. Does that make sense?
It's like she's putting her entire faith in God, and they're only putting a portion of what they have.
Yeah, that's a good metaphorical understanding, I think, that it's not her money. She's putting her entire self in praise and gratitude to God. This probably is a parable that Father Tim would not want to use in talking about the DSA. You never know. You never know. Is it about heroic sacrifice? Is it about, giving until it hurts? Giving everything? I think you're onto a good point there. That it's not about her contribution, but about this total self-giving. I heard a homily recently about this story from St. Peter's Episcopal. I saw online, and the deacon talked about this story and picked up on what some commentators are saying now. They point us to the context of the story. So just before this story, Jesus says, be on guard against the scribes who like to go around in long robes and love greetings in marketplaces, seats of honor in synagogues, and places of honor at banquets. They devour the houses of widows, and as a pretext recite lengthy prayers. They will receive a very severe condemnation. And then we have the story of the widow in the very next verse. They devour the houses of widows. It kind of puts you in mind of some televangelists who get people to empty out their wallets, you know, because God will bring them great gifts and lots of promise, all of that. And the point that's made is this isn't about encouraging people to empty out their pockets and give to the collection. It isn't about sacrifice that is above and beyond. Could it be about oppression? Has this woman been convinced that she should empty her pockets out, empty her purse out, in order to support the temple, and she and her family are going hungry? Could it be about that? Not so sure. But it's an interesting challenge, I think, that this woman is held up as an example. I think it makes us just ponder a little bit instead of thinking that the point is obvious. I think that's my point. I hope. Instead of thinking that the point is obvious, well, clearly it's all about giving generously, or giving beyond, even beyond what we think we can afford, giving more than our surplus. And there's a point to that too. You know, I think that's in our culture of giving to charities or to our churches, giving more than just our excess is a good thing. You know, to be able to go above and beyond the few dollars that we won't miss, to give more. But I think in the gospel story, there is something about this context of, has this woman been coerced? Is she coerced into doing this? Or, I like your point even better, that it's not about what she's giving monetarily. It's about giving her total self. It's about giving her entire life in some way. And that really is what the gospel is about for all of us, isn't it? That we're invited not simply to believe in certain teachings, or not simply to follow certain practices, but as Pope Benedict used to say, it's about a total experience. It's not about a system. It's not about about what do I want to say, a collection of teachings. It's not about agreeing with certain doctrines. It's about knowing this full experience of God's presence. And perhaps that's how we should hear this parable, and not use it as a basis for saying, you know, here, you should give until it hurts, and all of that.
Isn't it an intent though? Isn't the basis of it intent? I mean, if she's giving the substance and it's from, you know, a meager means, but she's giving with substance and her intent is to give from her heart, rather than someone who's superfluous and it's on the, you know, it's what, you know, but it's a little bit of show less than, you know, genuine.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes along with that other point, that it's not about how much she's giving, it's about her attitude. It's about her own giving of self in some ways. Yeah, thanks. The final thing that I had, and we're coming up on time, the final thing I wanted to point out, and there's really not much here, but the women who follow Jesus, the daughters of Jerusalem who follow Jesus along the way of the cross. A large crowd of people followed Jesus. This is chapter 23. Large crowd of people followed Jesus, including many women who mourned and lamented him. Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep instead for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming when people will say, 'Blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' At that time people will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if these things are done when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" That's unique in Luke's gospel. We'll hear that read for us on Palm Sunday in April when we read the Passion of Luke. These women are part of this group. They seem to be from Jerusalem, not necessarily the same people that came from Galilee with Jesus, but they are lamenting, and Jesus points out what's happening here. That there's a kind of a intention by Luke to indicate that there's injustice going on here. That's part of Luke's passion story is quite different from Mark and Matthew. Luke is definitely portraying Jesus as the innocent prophet. He emphasizes again and again the innocence of Jesus and the injustice of what happens to him. And this little story of the women kind of emphasizes that same thing. If they're doing this to me, what more are they going to do after me, and so on. Then finally, the women who accompanied Jesus from Galilee that we met in chapter 8, they show up again at the foot of the cross. They show up not at the foot of the cross, but when Jesus is buried. The women who had come from Galilee with him followed him, and when they had seen the tomb and the way in which the body was laid in it, they returned and prepared spices and perfumed oils. Then they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. And then these same women return to the tomb and find it empty. They're unnamed, but then we hear of Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, who are also part of this group. But again, these women who have followed Jesus, when we hear that the others have abandoned Jesus, presumably the men have run away, these women remain to be witnesses to the crucifixion and then witnesses the resurrection. And that's kind of where I would like to move next week. Not next week, but 2 weeks from now on March 2nd. I hope that's been some interest to see that these unique women, unique to Luke's gospel, can teach us a lot of things to think about with regard to the meaning of the gospel. For next time, I thought we could take a look at Martha and Mary, who are also unique in Luke, and a closer look at Mary Magdalene and some of the rumors and traditions and legends about her. But jump from Luke then to John, because Martha and Mary occur in John chapter 11, and Mary Magdalene is a key figure in the resurrection story in John. So I think focusing on them will be an interesting session. And if there's time, we can also go to John chapter 4 and look at the Samaritan woman, see what you have to think about that. So, comments, questions, other things?
You definitely made us think.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Your PowerPoint was breathtaking.
Yeah. We'll have to find some way around
Thank you, Peter.